Hello and welcome to Reason and Persuasion week 5, and this is the week when we will be looking at formal and informal logic. Now, don't worry, we're not going to do anything terribly technical on the logic side. We largely save that for next year, but I just want to make a few distinctions and offer you some Latin words, because we live in a world where having Latin words helps you be persuasive and have rhetorical clout. Okay, so the first thing to do is to define what an argument is. By the way, you might want to refer to the slides from StudyNet's site. So here is the first one. Okay. So an argument is a process of reasoning from one or more premises to a conclusion. And the question for us as logicians then is whether it's a process that you ought to follow. That's to say, whether from these premises you can reasonably derive that conclusion, whether the premises make it likely that the conclusion is true. So there's a difference between an argument in this philosophical, logical sense and the usual sense of argument as in blazing row. Although, think back to what we said last week about definitions and words and semantics and pragmatics and so on. One of the thoughts we had last week is that the various contrasts and meanings that a word can have can all play against each other. So although we distinguish in philosophy between argument in the sense of blazing row and an argument in the sense of a logical process that gets you from premises to conclusion, these two senses are not entirely unrelated, of course, because the reason you want to go from some premises to a conclusion may very well be in order to defeat the arguments of somebody else. That's to say, you may be in a blazing row and you might want to win by the best means, that's to say by logical means, right? Because those are the ones that have the hardest comeback. One bit of technicality, useful word from the world of mathematics is lemma, L-E-M-M-A. A lemma is an important intermediate result. So it's a kind of way station. You can think of it as, when they're climbing Everest, they will have base camps, they'll have camps that they pass through on the way. You can think of a lemma as a kind of logical equivalent of one of those. A really good lemma, of course, is a way station to all sorts of places. So it has a kind of logical hub. That's not tremendously important, but it's makes your argument seem classy if you can borrow a few words from mathematics, because mathematics is where is where the most compelling proofs are, right? So if you can make your shabby philosophical argument sound like a mathematical proof by scattering a few mathsy words around, well, that's good if you can get away with it, right? All right. So one of the first things we have to do is distinguish valid arguments from invalid arguments, right? So, first thing, it's arguments that can be valid or invalid, right? Not propositions, statements, or declarative sentences, right? Propositions, statements, declarative sentences can be true or false, right? But arguments can be valid or invalid, right? So I don't want to read any essays where people say, "Oh, that's a valid statement." Right? People say that outside logic, outside philosophy. Makes no sense inside philosophy, at least if you're thinking logically. Okay. So what does it mean for an argument to be valid? All right. It's valid if and only if, whenever all the premises are true, the conclusion is also true. Right. So the way to think of this is consider every possible state of affairs in which the premises of the argument are true. The argument is valid if in every possible state of affairs where the premises are true, the conclusion is also true, right? So another way to think of it is, an argument is valid if and only if you will never find a state of affairs in which the premises are all true and the conclusion's false, right? This definition has the curious side effect that all arguments with inconsistent premises are valid, right? Because think about what I just said. An argument is valid if and only if you will never find a state of affairs in which the premises are all true and the conclusion's false. Well, if the premises are inconsistent, you will certainly never find a state of affairs in which the premises are all true and the conclusion's false, because you won't find a state of affairs in which the premises are all true, because they're inconsistent. Don't worry about that too much. That's kind of technical side thought. Something else I want to note on the way is that this shows up a connection between the study of arguments, logic, the notion of validity on the one hand, and the philosophical reflections about what's possible and what's necessary on the other hand, right? Because the definition of validity says an argument is valid if it's just not possible for the premises all to be true and the conclusion to be false, right? So there's a deep connection between philosophy of logic and the philosophy of possibility and impossibility and necessity, what we call modality, right? So if you can add that to your list of rather interesting topics that philosophers debate that other people don't even know that the debate exists. Right? Okay, so that's validity. So to illustrate this a bit, notice that an argument can have premises or a conclusion that are false, right? So for example, if David Cameron is a lizard, and if all lizards are communists, then it follows validly, necessarily, that David Cameron is a communist. Now this is all false, right? Every one of those statements is false, but never mind, right? The argument is valid because in every possible world, that's one way of thinking about it, in every possible circumstance in which it's the case that all David Cameron is a lizard and all lizards are communists, then it has to be the case, right, in those possible worlds, in those circumstances, that David Cameron is a communist. You can also have valid arguments with false premises and a true conclusion. For example, imagine the circumstances where David Cameron is a lizard and all lizards are conservatives, right? It then follows that David Cameron is a conservative. Now, I understand, as advertised, David Cameron is, as a matter of fact, a conservative. So the conclusion is true and the argument's valid, but the premises are false. Right? So this is something to bear in mind, actually, while, for the purposes of this module, but also for reasoning in general, in particular writing philosophy essays. Just because you've defeated the argument, you haven't necessarily shown that the conclusion is false, right? Because somebody might be arguing for a conclusion that happens to be true, but with a terrible argument. So you show the argument is bad, and that means you don't have to believe the conclusion, but the conclusion could still be true. Just, we don't know it or nobody's proved it. Okay. Right, so all that validity says is that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Or to put it another way, equivalent, this says exactly the same thing. If the conclusion is false, then at least one of the premises must be false. Okay, so next definition. An argument is said to be sound, right? So here's the slide. Okay. So an argument is sound if it has true premises and it's valid, right? So soundness has two criteria: true premises and the argument is valid, right? And that means that a sound argument, the conclusion has to be true, right? So of course, in the business of arguing, in life, you want to produce sound arguments. But as logicians, we're only interested in validity. We don't care whether the premises are true or not. We're really only interested in the quality of the argument as logicians, right? As philosophers and as human beings, we have wider interests than that.